This is the story of how Marshall pedals' legacy began. The Supa Fuzz was released in 1967 for the pricely sum of £12 and 15 shillings. That would remain in production until approximately 1972. Jimi Hendrix used the Marshall Supa Fuzz from 1967 before switching to a Dunlop fuzz face later in the decade. Pete Townsend, Iggy and the Stooges and Jeff Beck all followed suit. Hot on the heels of the Supa Fuzz in 1967 was the Marshall Supa Wah. Unlike the majority of wah pedals, the initial Marshall Supa Wah featured low-gain transistors, which provided a smooth sound and singing highs. However, partway through the production, these were changed to silicon transistors. The change provided more low end and depth, creating a variation of the recognisable chukka chukka tone, but still saturated with 60s and 70s groove. We'd learnt a lot since developing our first amps in 1962 and our first pedals in 1967. We wanted to put that knowledge into practice. The idea was to create a guitar pedal that captured the best elements from our amps and squeezed the big black box down to a little black box, and that's how the Guv'nor came to be. Where the name came from is debated. Some say it's named after Jim, the Guv'nor, Marshall himself. Others say Jim got some players along to test the new pedals out. One guitarist absolutely loved it, claiming, "That pedal's just the Guv'nor, innit?" Either way, the name stuck. But what is not up for debate is quite how good it sounded. Designed to emulate the classic valve-driven sounds from a selection of our best-known amps, the Guv'nor provided a smooth, overdriven sound with a touch of compression. The pedal was heavily used by Gary Moore throughout the 90s and even appeared on the cover of his Still Got the Blues album. The success of the Guv'nor led us to developing 3 more pedals, each designed to provide players with the breakup and distortion that Marshall are globally recognised for. The Drive Master was a slightly updated Guv'nor, while the Blues Breaker was an organic overdrive that added lots of vibrancy and colour to your tone, and was based on the sound of the Blues Breaker amplifier. The Shred Master was at the other end of the scale, and provided more high gain distortion, but by today's standards is more suited to searing leads rather than heavy rock and metal. Originally released in 1991, these pedals were not an immediate hit, and production was discontinued in 1992. However, this isn't where the story ends, as the Blues Breaker would see a huge resurgence in popularity later in the 90s and noughties, thanks to Steve Craddock and John Mayer relying heavily on it. The Shred Master has a similar story, after it was repeatedly used by Radiohead's Johnny Greenwood across the Benz album. Fans wanted to recreate his totally unique sound, and the demand subsequently skyrocketed. The scope of the tone could also be heard on the bass line of Blur's Song 2, and became synonymous with gritty indie rock for many years to come. The Mark I series aimed to recreate the sound of Marshall amps in pedals, but their success actually came from offering something different that wasn't available elsewhere. The DRP-1, however, was a preamp that effectively recreated the tone of the JCM 800-2203. The DRP-1 used microelectronic techniques to emulate the tone and feel of a typical Marshall, so when placed in front of the amp, it provided plenty of tonal options. The late 90s saw pedal use and demand from guitarists increase, and players wanted to have complete control over their sound. 6 pedals were initially released in 1998. Amongst the first releases was the Guv'nor 2 and the Blues Breaker 2, which were the reimaginings of the original versions of these pedals. Also forming part of the initial release was the heavy distortion jackhammer, the switchable vibrato tremolo, Vibratrem, the dreamy Super Vibe chorus, and the fully flexible compressor. Later additions were echo head delay, reflector reverb, and regenerator, which combined a chorus, phaser and flanger into one handy package. The Mark II range of pedals were affordable, reliable and wide-ranging. Demand meant that these were consistently produced for 20 years since first being introduced, and will undoubtedly be on plenty of pedal boards for many years to come.